Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun had always been underestimated. At 5'4" and barely 130 pounds, she looked more like a college student than one of the Navy's most elite warriors. But behind her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance lay the heart of a warrior who had earned her seal trident through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to adapt to any situation. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence suggested that a group of international arms dealers had established a base of operations in the remote mountains of Eastern Europe. The facility was built into the side of a cliff face, accessible only by helicopter or an incredibly dangerous climbing route that most considered impossible. Sarah's team was tasked with gathering intel on the operation and identifying key personnel for future action. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that her team leader, Commander Jake Morrison, had serious doubts about having a woman on such a dangerous mission. Morrison was old-school Navy, the kind of man who believed that certain jobs were meant for men only. He had made his feelings clear during the pre-mission planning, though never directly to Sarah's face. The helicopter ride to the drop zone was tense. Sarah sat quietly checking her equipment while Morrison and the other 3 team members, all seasoned male SEALs, discussed the mission parameters. She could feel their skeptical glances, the way they seemed to talk around her rather than including her in their tactical discussions. It was nothing new. She had faced this kind of doubt throughout her entire military career. As the helicopter approached the mountainous terrain, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. The weather was deteriorating faster than expected. Heavy clouds had rolled in, and visibility was dropping rapidly. What had been planned as a precision insertion was quickly becoming a rush drop in less than ideal conditions. Morrison made the call to proceed anyway. The mission timeline was critical, and postponing could mean losing their window of opportunity. As they approached the drop zone, a rocky outcropping about 200 feet from the target facility, the helicopter struggled against increasingly violent wind gusts. Sarah was the first to notice something was wrong. The GPS coordinates on her device didn't match what she was seeing below. They were off target by at least half a mile, and instead of the relatively stable landing zone they had planned for, they were hovering over a sheer cliff face with almost no viable landing options. She tried to signal Morrison, but he was already giving the order to fast rope down. In the chaos of the deteriorating weather and poor visibility, her concerns were either not heard or dismissed. One by one, the team members began their descent. Morrison went first, followed by the other 3 SEALs. Sarah was last in line. As she prepared to begin her descent, she realized with growing horror that her teammates were not landing on solid ground. The spot Morrison had chosen was actually a narrow ledge barely wide enough for one person, and it was crumbling under the weight of 4 full-grown men in combat gear. She watched in shock as Morrison lost his footing first. The weathered rock gave way beneath him, and he tumbled backward into the abyss. In a domino effect, the other 3 SEALs followed, their ropes either snapping or pulling loose from their anchor points. In less than 30 seconds, her entire team had disappeared into the misty depths below. The helicopter pilot, fighting to maintain position in the worsening weather, was shouting through the radio for her to abort. The wind was becoming too dangerous, and they needed to leave immediately. But Sarah found herself in an impossible situation. Her team was gone, possibly dead, and the mission was compromised before it had even begun. In that moment, hanging from a rope above a deadly drop, Sarah made a decision that would define not just this mission, but her entire career. Instead of returning to the helicopter, she signaled the pilot to leave without her. She would complete the mission alone. The pilot protested, but Sarah was firm. She had studied the terrain extensively during mission planning, and she knew there were alternative routes to the target facility. Routes that would require skills that few people possessed, but routes that were possible for someone with her unique combination of training and determination. As the helicopter disappeared into the storm, Sarah found herself truly alone for the first time in her military career. No backup, no support, no team to rely on. Just her training her equipment, and the sheer cliff face that stood between her and the mission objective. She began her descent carefully, using techniques she had learned not just in SEAL training, but from years of rock climbing that had started as a childhood hobby. Her small frame, which had always been seen as a disadvantage, now became an asset. She could find handholds and footholds that would never support a larger person. The rock face was treacherous. Weathered limestone mixed with patches of loose shale created a constantly changing puzzle of safe and dangerous holds. Every few feet, she had to pause and reassess, finding new routes around unstable sections or areas where the rock had been weakened by years of harsh weather. About halfway down the cliff, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. A section of the rock face had collapsed, creating a gap of nearly 20 feet with no obvious handholds. Most climbers would have considered this impassable, but Sarah had always been known for thinking outside conventional parameters. She studied the gap carefully, noting the wind patterns and the way the mist swirled around the cliff face. There was a possibility, dangerous but feasible, that involved a controlled pendulum swing using her climbing rope. It would require perfect timing and absolute precision, but it was her only option for continuing the descent. The swing was terrifying. For several heart-stopping seconds, she hung suspended over the abyss, supported only by her rope and her own momentum. But her calculations proved correct, and she managed to grab hold of a stable outcropping on the far side of the gap. As she continued her descent, Sarah began to understand why this approach to the arms dealer's facility had been considered impossible. The rock face was not just technically challenging, it was actively hostile. Loose stones rained down constantly, and the weather seemed to be getting worse rather than better. But with each successful move, each obstacle overcome, Sarah felt something she had rarely experienced in her military career: complete confidence in her own abilities. For the first time, she wasn't trying to prove herself to skeptical teammates or demanding commanders. She was simply using every skill she possessed to accomplish the mission. The final approach to the facility required her to traverse horizontally across the cliff face for nearly 100 feet. This was perhaps the most dangerous part of the descent, as she would be fully exposed and unable to retreat quickly if discovered. But it was also where her small size became a crucial advantage. The handholds along this section were minimal, designed by nature rather than engineers. Only someone with her combination of strength, flexibility, and small stature could have made the traverse successfully. Larger SEALs would have simply been unable to distribute their weight appropriately across the tiny holds. As Sarah finally reached a position where she could observe the arms dealer's facility, she realized that her solo approach had actually provided advantages that a full team insertion would not have offered. She was completely undetected, with perfect observation angles and multiple escape routes that only someone with advanced climbing skills could utilize. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than intelligence had suggested. What they had thought was a simple storage and distribution point was actually a full manufacturing operation. Through the windows of the main building, Sarah could see workers assembling what appeared to be advanced weapon systems, far more dangerous than the small arms they had expected to find. She began documenting everything she observed, using specialized cameras designed for covert reconnaissance. The intelligence value of what she was seeing far exceeded the original mission parameters. This wasn't just an arms dealing operation. It was a sophisticated weapons development facility that posed a significant threat to international security. As she worked, Sarah became aware of increased activity within the facility. Guards were moving with more purpose, and she could see additional personnel arriving by helicopter. Something had changed, and she suspected it might be related to her team's failed insertion. The realization hit her like a physical blow. If Morrison and the others had survived their fall, they might have been captured. The increased security could mean that the arms dealers now knew they were under surveillance. Her mission had just become infinitely more complicated. But Sarah had come too far to abort now. She had proven to herself if no one else, that she was capable of accomplishing what others deemed impossible. The question now was whether she could gather the intelligence needed to justify the risks she had taken, and, more importantly, whether she could find a way to extract herself from a situation that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. As darkness began to fall over the mountains, Sarah prepared for the next phase of her mission. She had successfully reached the target, but the real test of her abilities was just beginning. The arms dealers might have thought they were untouchable in their cliffside fortress, but they had never encountered a Navy SEAL who could scale anything barehanded. Sarah spent the first hour of darkness studying the facility's security patterns. From her concealed position on the cliff face, she had an unobstructed view of the entire compound. The arms dealers had chosen their location well. The facility was built directly into the rock, with only one obvious entrance that was heavily guarded. But Sarah's unique vantage point revealed weaknesses that would be invisible to anyone approaching from conventional routes. The building's ventilation system included several large exhaust fans built into the cliff face itself. These openings were considered secure because reaching them would require advanced climbing skills that the facility's designers never imagined anyone would possess. They had underestimated the capabilities of a Navy SEAL who had spent her childhood scaling rock faces for fun. As Sarah planned her infiltration route, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. In a reinforced section of the facility that appeared to be used for detention, she could see figures moving behind barred windows. The size and movement patterns suggested military personnel rather than civilian workers. Her teammates might still be alive. The discovery changed everything. What had been a reconnaissance mission was now potentially a rescue operation. Sarah knew that attempting to extract captured SEALs would exponentially increase the mission's difficulty and danger, but she also knew that leaving her teammates behind was not an option. She began working her way horizontally across the cliff face toward the ventilation intake nearest to what appeared to be the detention area. The movement required absolute silence and perfect control. Any loose stone or careless handhold could alert the guards to her presence. The rock face in this section was different from what she had encountered during her descent. Years of industrial activity had weakened the stone, and several areas showed signs of recent repairs where pieces had broken away. Sarah had to test each handhold carefully before committing her full weight to it. About 20 feet from her target, Sarah encountered an unexpected complication. A section of the cliff face had been fitted with motion sensors, invisible wires that would trigger alarms if disturbed. The security system was more sophisticated than intelligence had indicated, clearly designed by someone who understood the theoretical possibility of a climbing approach. But the system's designers had made one crucial error. The sensors were positioned to detect movement along the most obvious climbing routes, assuming that anyone attempting this approach would follow conventional climbing logic. Sarah's unconventional background allowed her to identify an alternative route that avoided the sensor grid entirely. The path she chose required her to climb partially upside down, using an overhang in the rock face to bypass the sensors from above. It was exhausting work that demanded every ounce of her upper body strength, but it allowed her to reach the ventilation intake undetected. The intake cover was secured with industrial bolts that would normally require power tools to remove. But Sarah's equipment included specialized tools designed for covert entry. Working in complete darkness, relying entirely on touch, she carefully removed the bolts one by one. The ventilation shaft was barely large enough for her small frame. A larger person would never have been able to navigate the tight turns and narrow passages that led into the facility. As she crawled through the darkness, Sarah realized that every aspect of her physical build that had been questioned by doubters was proving essential to mission success. The shaft system was more complex than she had anticipated. Multiple branches led to different sections of the facility, and without blueprints, she had to navigate by sound and airflow patterns. The wrong choice could lead her into a dead end, or worse, into an area where her emergence would immediately compromise the mission. After nearly an hour of careful movement through the ventilation system, Sarah reached a position where she could hear voices below. The conversation was in English, which confirmed her suspicions about captured American personnel. She carefully removed a ventilation grate and found herself looking down into what was clearly an improvised detention area. Below her, she could see 3 figures in military fatigues. 2 were clearly her teammates, injured but alive. The third was unfamiliar, possibly a prisoner from an earlier operation. All 3 appeared to be restrained, but not under immediate guard. Sarah faced a critical decision. She could attempt an immediate rescue, but doing so would almost certainly compromise her ability to gather the intelligence that was the mission's primary objective. Alternatively, she could continue with reconnaissance and plan a more comprehensive operation that addressed both objectives. The choice was made for her when she heard footsteps approaching the detention area. Guards were coming, and from their conversation, she gathered that the prisoners were about to be moved to a more secure location. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Sarah dropped silently into the detention area, her arrival so unexpected that her teammates initially thought they were hallucinating. Morrison, despite his injuries, immediately began protesting that she should have evacuated rather than attempting a solo infiltration. But there was no time for discussion. Sarah quickly assessed the tactical situation while working to free her teammates from their restraints. The detention area had only one entrance, which was both an advantage and a liability. It limited the directions from which guards could approach, but it also meant there was only one escape route. The unknown prisoner introduced himself as Captain David Park, a South Korean intelligence officer who had been captured 3 weeks earlier while investigating the same arms dealing network. His presence confirmed that the facility's importance extended far beyond what American intelligence had realized. Park provided crucial information about the facility's layout and security procedures. The main laboratory, where weapons development took place, was located 2 levels below their current position, accessible through a service elevator that was only lightly guarded during nighttime hours. Sarah made the tactical decision to split their objectives. Morrison and the other injured SEAL would secure an extraction route while she and the least injured teammate would attempt to reach the laboratory for intelligence gathering. Park, despite his longer captivity, insisted on accompanying the intelligence team. Moving through the facility required careful timing and perfect coordination. Sarah's reconnaissance from outside had revealed the general pattern of guard rotations, but inside the building, additional security measures were evident. Cameras covered most corridors, and several areas required keycard access. The keycard problem was solved when they encountered a lone guard during a shift change. Sarah's hand-to-hand combat training allowed her to neutralize the threat silently while acquiring the access credentials they needed. The guard's unconscious form was concealed in a supply closet that wouldn't be checked until morning. The service elevator to the laboratory level was located exactly where Park had indicated. But as they approached, Sarah noticed something that hadn't been visible from outside the facility. The elevator shaft extended below the laboratory level, suggesting additional underground areas that didn't appear on any intelligence reports. The laboratory itself was a revelation that exceeded Sarah's worst expectations. The weapons being developed were not just advanced conventional arms, but sophisticated systems that appeared to incorporate stolen military technology from multiple nations. Serial numbers and markings indicated that classified American, British, and Israeli defense technologies were being reverse-engineered and combined in ways that could shift global military balances. Sarah and her teammate worked quickly to document everything they observed. Digital cameras captured images of weapon prototypes, computer screens displayed technical specifications, and file cabinets contained documentation that would take months for analysts to fully process. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence of planned distribution networks. Maps and shipping schedules indicated that completed weapons were being delivered to terrorist organizations and rogue states across 3 continents. The scope of the operation was far larger than anyone had imagined. As they completed their documentation, alarms suddenly began blaring throughout the facility. Their escape route had been compromised, either through the discovery of the unconscious guard or through security measures they hadn't anticipated. The mission had just shifted from covert intelligence gathering to a fighting retreat. Sarah quickly assessed their tactical options. The facility's security response was swift and professional, indicating that the arms dealers employed experienced military personnel rather than simple criminals. Standard escape routes would be quickly blocked, but Sarah's unique approach skills offered possibilities that conventional security wouldn't anticipate. She led her team to a section of the laboratory that extended into the natural rock face. Here, the building structure incorporated the original cliff face, including several openings that had been sealed but not reinforced. These represented potential exit points that could be opened with the explosive charges that every seal carried for emergency situations. The controlled explosion that breached their exit point also served as a distraction, drawing security forces away from Morrison's position and allowing the injured SEALs to begin their own escape sequence. But Sarah realized that getting everyone off the cliff face alive would require skills and coordination that pushed even her abilities to their limits. As gunfire echoed through the facility and searchlights began sweeping the cliff face, Sarah prepared for the most challenging phase of the mission that had already tested every aspect of her training. The arms dealers had discovered that their supposedly impregnable fortress could be breached, but they were about to learn that extracting a Navy SEAL from a cliff face was an entirely different challenge than keeping one out. The explosion that created their exit point had done more than just breach the laboratory wall. The blast had destabilized a section of the cliff face, creating new handholds and footholds while simultaneously making the rock more dangerous and unpredictable. Sarah found herself leading a team of 4 people down a route that was changing with every step. Morrison, despite his injuries from the original fall, proved that his doubts about Sarah's capabilities had been completely misguided. As she guided them through moves that seemed impossible, he began to understand that her selection for this mission hadn't been about meeting diversity quotas or proving political points. She possessed skills that no other member of their unit could have provided. The descent was complicated by the facility's response to their escape. Searchlights swept the cliff face continuously, and guards had positioned themselves at windows and openings throughout the building. Every few minutes, automatic weapons fire would rake across the rock face, forcing the team to freeze in whatever position they occupied until the barrage passed. Captain Park, weakened by his weeks of captivity, struggled to keep pace with the demanding physical requirements of the escape route. Sarah made the tactical decision to rope him directly to her own climbing harness, effectively carrying his weight in addition to her own. It was a decision that tripled the physical demands on her, but it was the only way to ensure that everyone reached safety. About 100 feet down from the laboratory, Sarah encountered a section of cliff face that had been damaged by the earlier blast. The rock was unstable, with several large pieces barely held in place by gravity and friction. Moving through this area would require perfect timing and absolute silence, as any disturbance could trigger a rock slide that would kill them all. She went first, testing each handhold and foothold before signaling the others to follow. The process was agonizingly slow, with each team member required to follow her exact path and hand placement. One wrong move by any of them would doom the entire team. Halfway through the unstable section, disaster struck. A searchlight beam caught Morrison as he reached for a handhold, and the sudden illumination triggered immediate weapons fire from the facility. Bullets struck the rock around him, and one shot hit a key support point that had been holding a massive section of cliff face in place. Sarah watched in horror as thousands of pounds of rock began to separate from the cliff face directly above Morrison's position. The rock slide would kill him instantly and likely take out the rest of the team as well. In a split-second decision that defied every tactical manual she had ever read, Sarah released her own secure position and launched herself toward Morrison. The physics of what she attempted should have been impossible. She was essentially trying to swing across empty space using only her climbing rope and momentum while simultaneously grabbing Morrison and pulling him clear of the falling rocks. It was a move that required perfect timing, absolute precision, and strength that exceeded normal human capabilities. But Sarah had spent her entire life exceeding normal human capabilities. Her rope caught Morrison just as the rock slide thundered past their previous position. For several terrifying seconds, both seals hung suspended over the abyss, supported only by Sarah's anchor point and her grip on Morrison's equipment harness. The rescue had cost them precious time and exposed their position to every guard in the facility. Weapons fire was now constant, and Sarah could hear helicopter rotor sounds approaching from the distance. The arms dealers were bringing in aerial support, which would make their escape exponentially more difficult. Sarah made a command decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of continuing the descent, she began leading the team horizontally across the cliff face, moving away from the facility rather than directly down. It seemed counterintuitive, but she had spotted something during her initial reconnaissance that could provide them with a significant tactical advantage. About 200 yards from the main facility, the cliff face was intersected by a deep ravine that had been carved by centuries of water erosion. The ravine was invisible from most angles, which explained why it hadn't appeared in intelligence reports, but it offered a concealed route down to the valley floor that would be impossible for the facility's security forces to monitor. Reaching the ravine required the team to traverse the most exposed section of cliff face they had yet encountered. They would be visible to the facility for several minutes, completely vulnerable to weapons fire and unable to seek cover. It was an enormous risk, but Sarah calculated that their current position was even more dangerous in the long term. The traverse began with Morrison providing covering fire from their concealed position while Sarah led the others across the exposed section. Her teammates followed in sequence, each person's movement covered by the previous person suppressing fire. It was a textbook example of fire and movement tactics adapted to an environment where no textbook had ever envisioned such techniques being used. Sarah reached the ravine entrance just as the helicopter arrived at the facility. The aircraft was a military model equipped with thermal imaging and heavy weapons, capabilities that would make their previous concealment tactics ineffective. But the ravine offered something that even thermal imaging couldn't overcome: complete physical separation from the facility's line of sight. Getting everyone safely into the ravine required Sarah to essentially belay each team member individually. The ravine entrance was a nearly vertical drop that would have been impossible for injured or exhausted personnel to negotiate without assistance. Sarah anchored herself at the top and lowered each person one by one, using techniques that pushed her equipment and her physical endurance to their absolute limits. Captain Park was the most challenging to lower. His weeks of captivity had weakened him significantly, and he was barely conscious by the time Sarah got him safely into the ravine. But his intelligence about the facility's operations was too valuable to lose, and Sarah was determined that everyone who had entered that laboratory would leave the mountain alive. The ravine provided the concealed route Sarah had hoped for, but it also presented new challenges. The bottom was filled with loose rocks and debris that made silent movement impossible. Every step generated sounds that echoed off the ravine walls, potentially alerting any pursuit teams to their location. But the ravine had one crucial advantage: it was too narrow for helicopter operations. The arms dealer's aerial support was useless in the confined space, reducing the threat profile significantly. Sarah led her team through 2 hours of careful movement down the ravine, following a route that gradually descended toward the valley floor. As dawn approached, the team emerged from the ravine onto a broad plateau that offered multiple extraction options. Sarah used her emergency communications equipment to contact headquarters, providing GPS coordinates and requesting immediate helicopter extraction. The intelligence they had gathered was too important to risk further delays. While they waited for extraction, Sarah took the opportunity to review the digital files and photographs they had captured in the laboratory. The evidence documented an arms dealing network that spanned multiple continents and involved technology transfers that threatened national security on a global scale. Their mission had uncovered something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Morrison, reflecting on the previous 18 hours, finally addressed the doubts he had expressed about Sarah's capabilities. His apology was brief and professional, but it acknowledged that his preconceptions had been not just wrong, but potentially dangerous to mission success. Sarah's unique combination of skills had not just saved the mission, it had saved all their lives. The extraction helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, piloted by crews who expressed amazement that anyone had successfully infiltrated and escaped from the supposedly impregnable cliffside facility. As they lifted off from the plateau, Sarah could see the arms dealer's facility in the distance, now swarming with security personnel who were still trying to understand how their fortress had been breached. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to process what had occurred. She had proven beyond any doubt that size and gender were irrelevant when measured against skill, determination, and tactical intelligence. The mission had required capabilities that only she possessed, and she had delivered results that exceeded every expectation. But, perhaps more importantly, Sarah had demonstrated that the military's most elite units were stronger when they embraced diverse capabilities rather than conforming to traditional expectations. Her teammates had learned that excellence came in many forms, and that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones made about their own limitations. The intelligence gathered during the mission led to a coordinated international operation that dismantled the arms dealing network within 6 months. Dozens of arrests were made, and weapon shipments to terrorist organizations were intercepted across multiple continents. The cliffside facility was destroyed by precision airstrikes, ensuring that its sophisticated manufacturing capabilities could never again threaten global security. Sarah received commendations from multiple intelligence agencies, but the recognition she valued most came from her teammates. Morrison recommended her for promotion and specifically requested her assignment to future high-risk missions. The other SEALs who had initially questioned her presence became her strongest advocates within the special operations community. The mission became legendary within Navy SEAL training programs, studied as an example of how individual excellence and team adaptation could overcome impossible odds. Sarah's techniques for cliff face infiltration and escape were incorporated into advanced climbing curricula, expanding the tactical options available to future SEAL teams. But Sarah herself remained focused on the fundamental lesson that the mission had reinforced, that the most powerful weapon any warrior possessed was the refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. She had been dropped off the edge of a cliff by people who doubted her capabilities, and she had proven that a Navy SEAL could indeed scale anything barehanded, especially when motivated by the knowledge that failure was not an option. The arms dealers had learned too late that their choice of an impregnable location had been based on conventional assumptions about what was possible. They had never considered that their greatest security vulnerability would come from someone small enough, skilled enough, and determined enough to approach their fortress from directions they never thought to guard. Sarah Chun had taught them, and the entire special operations community, that the most dangerous opponent was often the one who had been underestimated from the very beginning.